Hello and welcome to this evening's edition of Tisky Sam. My name's Aaron Bastani. It's my immense pleasure to be joined this evening by Michael Walker, whose cheekbones are higher than a Shoreditch estate agent at Lovebox Festival. And of course, the one and only Jo Grady, the General Secretary of the UCU, the University and College Union. Before I introduce you, Jo, I'm going to introduce the UCU, which is a British trade union in further higher education with around 120,000 members. Is that right?
126,000.
126,000. And it's the largest further and higher education union in the world, is that correct?
It's the largest tertiary education union in the world, yeah.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Jo became the UCU's General Secretary 12 months ago after the previous incumbent, Sally Hunt, stood down, winning a whopping 64% of the vote in the final round of voting. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I got elected in May, so it wasn't quite a year ago.
Oh, I've got your Wikipedia says February. However,
Wikipedia is always wrong.
Yeah, that's true. However, I'm actually doing a disservice to Novara Media here because we have an article from our very own Craig Gent, which is from May, which is a hint. Mm-hmm. Maybe the campaign. Oh no, maybe Sally Hunt went. Maybe she resigned in February.
Sally, I do think, yeah, that might be correct, but I didn't start until actually August, but I got elected in May.
Yeah, I was like, it doesn't feel that long ago. Time flies. And, yeah, it wasn't that long ago. This is a great article from our very own Craig Gent about precisely that. Right now, Jo is the youngest General Secretary in the country. We think that may be about to change. I just wanted to ask you a question about that. Do you think that the fact you're the youngest General Secretary, does that reflect changes in the academia industry more broadly? Are your sort of workers, are they tending to be younger now than they were, say, 20, 30 years ago?
So I think in education, but particularly maybe in HE, which is the sector that I was from, there are lots of younger workers. The difference is that, you know, if you were thinking back to maybe 10 years ago, the career progression and trajectory into HE in particular, those career paths aren't there so much anymore. So people spend either a much longer time in fixed term contracts or indeed like never actually make it into a permanently securely employed job. But I think in general, education as a sector, so FE and HE that UC represents, but HE, there are lots of people in my union who do look just like me, who are a similar age to me, who, you know, have studied for years to move into that profession if they're an academic, or, you know, have studied for years to be a professional in the other sectors of HE that we represent, so librarians or, you know, counselling, and be made the shock absorbers essentially of that system. So I think part of my election and part of my appeal to UCU members was actually that they could recognise a lot of their own experiences in me. And I very much campaigned when I ran to be General Secretary on issues that I thought were the most pressing for education. And they were how we respond to the hostile environment, how we respond to casualisation and insecure employment, how we respond to spiralling workloads that make people unwell, and how we protect workers in our workplaces with regards to things like sexual harassment. So I think the combination of campaigning on those issues was what was
because it is. I mean, you're the outlier in so much as you're and this again sounds quite glib, but you're a millennial General Secretary, which is really, really rare. But then you think it's a huge part of the UK labour market, and they're so underrepresented when it comes to organised labour in this country. You think we had Len McCluskey on, 2 weeks ago? Wonderful interview, but I think Len's 69, Dave Prentice is early 70s. There's a weird sort of gap, which hopefully more and more General Secretaries won't necessarily be from older generations in the next couple of years.
I think the thing is, if you ask people what they, you know, their stereotypical view of a General Secretary, it's going to be people like who you've just listed. But if you look on the ground, who is doing organising, who is putting the graft in campaigns, it's often, you know, younger workers, precarious workers, and often women, and often women of colour. If you look at the PCS, the action that they just took at Bays about outsourcing, that was, I think, you know, there will have been some white strikers, but I visited their picket lines and it was almost entirely women of colour and black women in particular. And I think that my experience has been when women actually run for positions, they do quite well. So UCU, a lot of our elected officers are women. Sarah Woolley, who will be the youngest General Secretary, if she's not already, of the Bakers Union, she organised McStrikers, and she organised in the fast food industry. It's all women that's doing that hard work. I think we are happy to roll our sleeves up and get stuck in.
That's really fascinating as a sociological shift. You wanted to say something, Michael?
No, I was just going to, I suppose, foreground our later conversation on the Labour leadership and say that that's not a race where when women stand, they tend to get elected, if we're to believe the latest polls from Sky News. But, we'll discuss that later.
But also there are, in Labour now, the majority of Labour MPs are women.
That is true.
Its most recent cohort of income is a younger.
So on average, when women stand in, I suppose, selection to be MPs, it seems like they're being very successful if you look at the proportions of the PLP.
We are going to talk about the Labour leadership race, and we're also going to talk about free speech on campus. No doubt we'll clip that up, make it a shareable, and we'll get a response from Carl of Swindon. Look forward to that. But we're going to talk about UCU first. Right now, Jo's union is on strike. It's actually amid what it's termed the biggest wave of strike action the sector has ever seen in the UK. Right now, UCU members at 74 universities, I hope that's right after my getting that date. 74 universities are on strike. They were on strike on Monday, Tuesday and today. They were also undertaking action on the 20th and 21st of February, with further action planned for the 2nd to the 5th of March and from the 9th to the 13th of March. On top of all that, there was, of course, industrial action, which took place before Christmas. While the UCU says there's been solid support for such action, the Universities and Colleges Employers Association claimed that participation had fallen since the first round of strikes before Christmas. Jo, these strikes are fundamentally about pensions. Can you explain, you've already hinted at it, I guess, the broader political context within which they're happening, as well as the real specifics of why your members are on strike right now?
Yeah, so to correct you again, they're actually about two issues, pensions and pay, but the pay dispute is about other issues that are wrapped in with pay. So I'll talk about the pay dispute first, because the other key issues are casualisation, so the proliferation of insecure employment in universities, about unmanageable workloads. So for instance, I was at a picket line in Leeds Trinity, which is just outside of Leeds, last week, and the week after Christmas, or week after New Year rather, the staff there, because they were preparing and teaching the new semester, but also marking, were working 75 hours a week. And that's not that uncommon, actually, for people to be pulling those kinds of weeks. So it's insecure employment, workload intensification, and then really scandalous equality pay gaps. So in HE, gender pay gap's 15%. And if you're a black member of staff, you generally have a pay gap of 14%. So, and I think that people don't really realise this, but what I've been saying is universities, some of the UK's most exploitative employers, universities are saying that they can't afford to address these issues. But they've never spent less of their money on staff than they currently do. And actually that message is, well, we can't afford to pay people for the work they do. We can't afford to put people on proper contracts, and we can't afford to pay marginalised people the going rate that we would a white man, which is just unacceptable, especially when they've saved money on what they spend on staff. So 10 years ago, they were spending 58% of their expenditure on staff. Now they're spending 54%. The other dispute that we've got is a pensions dispute, and that has been long running now since... this particular dispute since 2018, but we've been in dispute about this particular pension USS since 2011. There's been consistent attempts to downgrade it and dilute the value of it. So an average UCU member since that time has lost about £240,000 from the value of their pension. The 2018 dispute, which you might remember, was about saving it from a defined benefit scheme to a defined contribution scheme, which is essentially a guaranteed income in retirement for anybody who's not a pensions nerd. And now is about actually shoring up what that means. So we kind of won the battle on the argument, if you like, about the scheme being sound and being able to maintain the scheme. But employers haven't worked with the union to ensure that in this interim period, we can keep lower paid members in the scheme. We have a 15% opt-out, which is really high for a pension scheme. So it's these two disputes combined, which the 74 branches up and down the UK are in dispute about.
If I was to sort of make be a contrarian idiot, which I can be, but not on this particular issue, what you often see, there was, for instance, an attack piece in the Daily Mail today, and they said that your members actually get, compared to the rest of the labour market, a good deal when it comes to pensions, because you get final salary pensions. It's indexed to your final earnings rather than to the cost of living, which used to be the norm. 25, 30 years ago. What would you say to that in response?
So, and you're right, we do get these questions. It's the defined benefit career average scheme. It was downgraded from a final salary, full final salary. But the point is it's a good scheme because members pay a lot of money into it. So at the minute, people are paying 9.6%. That's a lot of your salary into a pension. And it's been maintained as a good scheme because the unions fought for it and members have taken action when they've needed to. And I think that it's, and it comes back to this argument about things being unaffordable. Things that are worth paying into and are worth preserving and saving are expensive. So a good education system is expensive. A good NHS is expensive. It doesn't mean they can't be good value for money, but they take money. And a good pension scheme, if you're wanting a decent guaranteed income in retirement, you accept that you're going to have to pay some good money into that. And if, HE in the UK wants to continue being one of the best sectors in the world, that students want to come and spend all that money to come and study here, then they should treat their staff properly. And that means investing in staff. And we've been saying in all of the media appearances we've been doing, investment in staff is investment in students. And students know that. And that's why they're mostly supporting the strikes.
You've had a big shift in the politics of the UCU, I guess, since you whilst you were completing your PhD, which we'll talk about more in a second, you became a UCU member, became actively engaged, became the General Secretary. There's been a big, or I saw it when I was doing my PhD as well, a big shift in the politics of higher education, partly as an outgrowth of what happened in the austerity years. Is it fair to say there's been a big move away from what was historically quite a conservative union, small c conservative union, into a radical union? And is that a reflection of sort of the changed sociology of Britain's higher education, as something that Michael's going to talk about, I think, with some of the new Labour stuff? Or is it something else? Are you now one of the most radical trade unions in the country? Which we wouldn't have thought that 15, 20 years ago.
I think it depends on what you're defining as radical. I think what I would say is the unique blend of UCU membership. So, you think of all the different types of skill sets and sort of professional identities that are bundled into delivering education in this country, whether that's professional services, teaching, adult ed, we represent prison members. These are people who are intelligent, who look at evidence, but who also, have chosen to work to some degree in education, whether that's delivering research or, as I say, all those other things. And I really think that what you've seen in that time period that you're talking about, so, maybe the last 10 to 15 years, is just an abundance of evidence that neoliberalism, austerity, whatever kind of language you want to badge it as, is not working. Is not good for students, is not good for education, is not good for staff within that sector. If we think about HE in particular, and we think about the student protests that happened during the coalition government when we saw the introduction of tuition fees, most of the people I worked with before I got elected to GenSec were on those demos. We were with students. So I don't think it's that you can necessarily say UCU members are more radical per se than any other union membership or are innately radical in that sense. I think that what you see is really bad policy being forced through in education and staff and students within it being made to be the shock absorbers of that. And I think that what you've seen is a response to that. I don't think it's necessarily something else. And if those circumstances have politicized people, then I think that's different. And I also think that when you have a union that fights for these things as opposed to managing the decline of them, that then also encourages people to stand up and fight for those things too. So I think that there's a number of different factors that play into whether or not a union engages in these types of disputes as opposed to whether or not they back away from them.
Yeah, I wanted to just ask, I suppose, a few more speculative questions about the broader politics of higher education under a Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings government.
Yeah.
And I suppose one of my curiosities about this is I think you are seeing on the right an understanding that having such a large proportion of the population going and doing humanities at university creates a population which is quite socially liberal and potentially quite left-wing. I mean, you've already seen sort of like the culture wars on campus quite seriously take off in the United States, where the right-wingers are sort of like, look, we've got parts of the media and we've got quite a lot of politics, but we've missed out on higher education and the cultural production there. And I was wondering if you feel like the Conservatives are really attacking higher education, and especially the humanities in higher education, because they're worried that universities, as they stand at the moment, are kind of a factory for left-wing young people. And if you feel like the humanities and universities are under attack.
I think from my perspective, what you've seen in education, both FE and HE, is, an openly anti-working class agenda. What you've seen in some of the proposals, so the Auger review was something that happened last year, is the idea that, science and technology type subjects should be, prioritised. And I think, what you're saying is what can university represent to people, particularly if you don't have the cash or you're not from the background where you would normally go. And it can represent space and time to be introduced to things that you would have never been introduced to think about things that you never would. And I think, to go back to your question, is that it's really easy for people who don't understand that, because they always had those things anyway, to assume that lecturers are manipulating students. And, if you've ever taught students of any age, I imagine, but all I have experience of is university students, it's really difficult to get them to agree with you just because you tell them something. The idea that they are somehow duped by their lecturers is just absurd. It's really, really absurd. And I think what it actually demonstrates, I think I would agree with your opening comment, is that they don't understand that actually educating people, teaching them to look at evidence, opening their minds, you then give them the skills to critically analyse things. And that might mean that they critically analyse your government. And I think one of the best examples of this was 7 years ago with the junior doctors. And a lot of the junior doctors who took part in that dispute, to go back to the tuition fees, were students at that time. And I think one of the reasons that they actually were able and willing to take on a government like the way they did is because they've been trained to look at evidence, and they've been trained to be really calm in the face of that stuff. And they also know you can't remove politics from healthcare, and you can't remove politics from education in that way either. So yeah, they're kind of, the push to get people to go to university that you saw under New Labour opened up, I think, a generation that I'm kind of part of people who maybe wouldn't have normally going to uni going. And that's now this group of people that are in their 30s.
Working class critical thinkers who tend to vote Labour. Do you think they're going to try and shrink the proportion of the population that goes to university?
The fact that younger people are more inclined to vote against Conservative policy at the minute, in my mind, is not necessarily because they're either highly educated or not highly educated. It's because their experiences of growing up in this world means that they can see they've got a shafted future. And I don't think that really matters if you leave school with GCSEs or if you end up leaving university with a PhD. That's kind of why UCU members are on strike, because there's plenty of really, really well-educated people in their 30s who are living in the sort of rented accommodation you're living when you're 17. They've also got another problem, that if they attempt to sort of shut down universities, that's going to put a lot of higher education staff out of jobs. It is going to close down some cities where universities are really, the economy that's keeping things booming.
Labour voting cities, though.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also the small businesses within those cities, international students come. So they've got a problem, because in one way I would agree with you that it would be in their interest to say we don't want the working classes educated, so let's look at what we're doing. But they would also basically have to work on the basis that they're closing down parts of higher education, which would be bold, because there would be huge knock-on consequences, which presumably they either have or haven't thought about. So I don't know. I'm going to reserve giving you a proper answer on that, I'm afraid.
I mean, it reminds me of George Osborne, when Nick Clegg was privy to it, and George Osborne apparently said to David Cameron and Nick Clegg, when he was challenged about social housing, he said, we're not going to build more social housing because it creates Labour voters. And the exact same rationale would apply to expanding HE. Why should we expand HE? It creates Labour voters. And it's not, of course, causation is difficult to talk about. But if you're 35, you're more likely to vote Labour if you have a degree than if you don't have a degree. Now, that's not to say they're more intelligent or anything. It's just an observation. And so purely from that kind of electoral calculus, it wouldn't be entirely implausible for the Tories to be thinking along those lines, would it?
No, I think from my perspective, what you're seeing is the attempt to weed out working class people from universities and from arts and humanities degrees via other paths. So the things that you're encouraged to study at school for GCSE, the actual stuff you can study at your local college if you're from a working class town or city, the actual options available to you that then lay the path if you want to go to university and what you might study. If you look at the types of degrees that people do that run the country, it's particular types of degrees. It's PPE or it's classics. These are not degrees that you study enough at school if you're from a working class town and go to a comprehensive. So that it's not just about education, I suppose, is the point I'm making. It's about all of the networks and the privilege and the friends that you make if you go to the right universities. And I think that without wanting to jump ahead to whatever you may be talking about the Labour leadership contest, for Labour to get elected, it's going to have to take a lot more than just working class kids going to uni and there being more people who might vote Labour. I think that the challenge is much bigger than that.
Yeah, we'll talk about Labour right now. The last 24 hours have seen interesting developments in the Labour leadership race. On Monday, we spoke of how Rebecca Long-Bailey had to challenge Keir Starmer on his funding and that nobody, particularly those in the media, would do it for her. Well, she did. She created a site where every single funder who's given her more than £1,500 is now publicly visible. The only major union to give her big money is Unite. They've given her 2 donations, each of £100,000. I think Fox maybe can bring up that donor list. The website is rebeccaforleader.org/donor list. This matters. Why? Because the Starmer campaign could have cost as much as £1 million so far. And surely the funding behind that should be public. As that story landed, the thing that was of value seemingly to most journalists is, oh, look, Unite have given her £200,000 rather than saying who paid for a potentially £500,000 mail out from Keir Starmer.
Yeah, that Robert Peston tweet is, very telling. So one, he's got this very bizarre sort of comment about the Unite logo that I didn't really understand what he was talking about. But then he's looked at this press release from Rebecca Long-Bailey, which says that I'm publicising my funding sources. And he said, he's looked at it and he thought the dirt here was that there were some trade unions with hundreds of thousands of members who pay their political dues knowingly, the organised working class in this country, who decided to fund Rebecca Long-Bailey's campaign. Obviously it was the elected leadership of those unions decided to fund the Rebecca Long-Bailey campaign. What he hasn't tweeted about, and I've checked through his Twitter, is the fact that Rebecca Long-Bailey is the only candidate to have done so. So obviously, as we were saying on Monday, Rebecca Long-Bailey has to make a big deal out of publishing her, who's funded her, and then that will mean that the British press have no choice but to cover the fact that Keir Starmer hasn't released his.
Well, she should have printed it out. Props. Always helps.
We overestimated.
Like, here are my donors.
We overestimated the critical capacity of the British press because no, even once she'd done that, still no one asks who is funding Keir Starmer.
Well, maybe Peston has him tonight, but yeah, I very much doubt it.
I was thinking maybe he hasn't tweeted it because he wants to spring it on Keir Starmer this evening, but
possible.
But Keir Starmer is going to be expecting that question, and it's not like Peston's doing this incredibly smart and long game where he's not going to tweet about it now because he's going to spring it on Keir Starmer later. Keir Starmer knows that question is coming, so why subject yourself to so why not cover the story when it's a story when Rebecca Long-Bailey publishes it in the first place?
Jo, you obviously ran for office, different kind of office, quite recently. How did it work in terms of how transparent you had to be around people giving money to your campaign?
So, just on Rebecca, I think it's really unfortunate that someone who's attempted to be so transparent is then being held to more scrutiny than everyone else. But anyway, so I crowdfunded my own campaign. We set up a crowdfunder when I announced I was running. I can't remember. We ended up raising small change compared to this. We ended up raising, I think, £3,500, maybe to 4. I really can't remember. And we kept a itemised list of everything we spent it on, from badges to posters to trains that I had to get. And we posted up a spreadsheet of all of that expenditure after I got elected. And what was left over, we donated to the Unions Fighting Fund.
Oh.
Yeah.
So
wholesome.
The polar opposite of what's going on with the Starmer campaign, potentially. Sky News today published a very favourable set of polling for Keir Starmer. This is a tweet up from Sam Coates, who's at Sky. Maybe we can get that up. Doesn't necessarily mean it's all over for Rebecca Long-Bailey, but it's looking pretty good for Keir Starmer. He is on right now, I think 53%, and he wins in the first round. getting a representative sample for any kind of internal election always hard, but intuitively that sounds about right, doesn't it?
And what they've, it sounds about right to me. And what they've said is this is the first poll where they have been able to poll affiliate members as well. So one of the big unknowns in this race has been how will people who have a right to vote via their trade unions vote? And this poll has, to be honest, actually found that people who are voting via their trade unions are more likely to back Keir Starmer than they are to back Rebecca Long-Bailey. It looks like he is going to run away with this race. And given the fact that, such a huge proportion of people who vote in these leadership elections vote when the ballots drop, and they're dropping this week, it's looking like he has it in the bag. Although, it's not a terrible showing from Rebecca Long-Bailey. One thing that is quite striking about these results is, at least in terms of Starmer and Long-Bailey, not much has changed in the campaign. I think Rebecca Long-Bailey is down 1 point from the poll that was done in December. Keir Starmer up a couple. I think he's up 9, which is to suggest that lots of the Jess Phillips vote went to Keir Starmer, but Rebecca Long-Bailey
as well, right?
Basically hasn't moved. And which I suppose, given how we've talked about this campaign on the show, is not a surprise, because it hasn't been a particularly eventful leadership campaign. You look over to the Democratic race in the United States. They're ripping chunks out of each other and all giving dramatically different visions of what America should look like and what the Democratic Party should be fighting for. And here you've all just got people standing up on stage saying losing was bad, winning would be good.
What do you think's better for Labour? Obviously, as somebody who competes in these elections, do you think that candidates should be scrutinising one another's political records, policy offers, or should it be more sort of, quote unquote, comradely?
I think it's not a surprise that everybody is, even if this isn't the case behind the scenes, that everybody is attempting to be as comradely as possible, because I think, if you were somebody who wanted a Labour government, we all know how damaging it's been for the infighting and the airing of dirty laundry to be apparent for everyone to see. So from that perspective, I actually think people maintaining a bit of discipline, even if it's kind of, not messy enough for you in terms of drama, is actually probably quite a positive thing. Because I think, without wanting to be mega depressing, if we're looking at 10 years out of government rather than just 5, whoever you elect as leader probably isn't going to be the next prime minister. So what you're really electing as leader is somebody who's going to be able to bring the party back together, hopefully with a deputy leader that will work with them, set the party, in my hope, on the right path in terms of the politics that we want without necessarily compromising, but can actually unite a party that has been very divided. So, I agree with you. It'd be nice for there to be something a bit spicier, but in some ways it's quite possibly a good thing. Sorry to be dull.
No, it's a good answer. I think it's probably a sweet spot, but it's easier.
I disagree. Because
it's easy said than done.
I just feel like if the point of a leadership election is to be tested, right? You want to know who is going to be the best leader of the party, and you'll only know who's best when you see how they respond to attacks. Because whoever wins, if it's Keir Starmer, Lisa Nandy or Rebecca Long-Bailey, they're going to be subject to 5 years of attacks now. So we have to know that they're good at fighting back. So I feel like, in a way, no one's wanted to attack, especially Keir Starmer, because he's the front runner, because they think that would potentially make them look like a divisive figure. But it would actually be doing a public service for the left, for someone to put themselves out there and test this guy.
I agree with you, actually, that this idea, and I think I've definitely heard it said, this idea that, any of the candidates are inherently more electable than the other because the right-wing media won't go for them in the same way. It's just utter rubbish. I think, some Labour leaders, past Labour leaders now have been rehabilitated, and people seem to forget that they were torn to shreds by the right-wing media. So, yeah, maybe some good soul will volunteer in the way that you've suggested.
There'll be files on all of them.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of akin to, right now, the Labour leadership race is a bunch of people, they're having sort of like a pillow fight.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Whoever wins basically is confronted with like bare knuckle fighting in a car park, right? Which, does one prepare you for the other? Probably not. But I agree with both your points, really, I think. We've got a picture here from Keir Starmer at a UCU strike today. Just to show,
I think he visited 2.
This is not a Keir bashing operation, just to be clear. So where else did he go? This is IOE.
I've been busy today, so I don't want to. I think he went to SOAS, and I think this is the IOE, which is sort of in and around UCL, which is, I cannot really thank all of the Labour candidates in these elections, but Labour MPs that have been on UCU picket lines, both in this dispute and in previous ones. It's a huge bounce to members when they turn up, and it demonstrates just how far the Labour Party's moved.
Because it's not just Keir Starmer, obviously Rebecca Long Bailey, and
Lisa Nandy was
as well,
at
right?
Manchester, I think. Angela Rain. Yeah, I'm pretty sure, not that I'm keeping tabs, but I'm pretty sure they've all been able to attend UCU picket lines. It's been great.
So that's all three of the people presently running for the Labour leadership have shown solidarity with the UCU. That makes a really sharp difference to members, and it's also a big break with what went before. Here's Ed Miliband, not that long ago, talking about teachers going on strike.
These strikes are wrong at a time when negotiations are still going on, but parents and the public have been let down by both sides because the government has acted in a reckless and provocative manner. After today's disruption, I urge both sides to put aside the rhetoric, get round the negotiating table and stop it happening again.
I listened to your speech in Wrexham and you talked about the Labour Party being a movement. A lot of people in that movement are the people who are on strike today, and they'll be looking at you and thinking, well, you're describing these strikes as wrong. Why aren't you giving us more leadership as a leader of the Labour movement?
At a time when negotiations are still going on, I do believe these strikes are wrong. And that's why I say both sides should, after today's disruption, get round the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric and sort the problem out. Because the public and parents have been let down by both sides. The government's acted in a reckless and provocative manner.
I spoke to Francis Moore before I came here, and the tone he was striking was a very conciliatory one. Do you think there's a difference between the words they're saying in public and the attitude they're striking in private in these negotiations? Are there negotiations in good faith, would you say?
What I say is that the strikes are wrong when negotiations are still going on, but the government has acted in a reckless and provocative manner in the way it's gone about these issues. After today's disruption, I urge both sides to get around the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric, and stop this kind of thing happening again.
I mean, that just really reveals how much has shifted politically since 2015.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that video goes on for quite a lot longer of Ed Miliband doing exactly the same thing to every question that's asked of him. To make sense of what's going on there, because obviously, you know, if that 4 minutes appeared on ITV News, people would think, what the hell is this guy doing? But that was he was there giving an interview for what's called a pull clip, which is where they had all the news are trying to get from you is a 10-second clip for them to put on the news. And so I think what Ed Miliband was thinking there is that if I give them longer answers, then they'll take the bit which puts me in a bad light. But then obviously that doesn't work in a social media age, because that's going to get uploaded and then you look like a right numpty, as he did in that situation. I mean, my worry there, though, is that, and to be serious about this, is that, for one, I mean, sometimes when I listen to Ed Miliband, I do get worried at how similar him and Keir Starmer can sound. But two, I think that potentially if Keir Starmer, you know, came a few years earlier and he'd been elected in 2011, he could well have been speaking in the same tones as Ed Miliband is there. We know that in 2013, Keir Starmer was talking about the importance of clamping down on benefits cheats. So he is someone who is known to discursively triangulate on these issues, which is clearly what Ed Miliband was trying to do there. He was saying, like, you know, we have to take into account that the employers are being irresponsible and the workers are being irresponsible, and we're not going to take a position, but we're just going to say this is all very unfortunate and wrong. And so that's one fear, is that once Keir Starmer is elected and he's no longer speaking to the Labour electorate, he'll go back into that sort of 2010 to 2015. You know, it's not quite Blairism, but it's not particularly inspiring. The alternative and positive outcome, and given it looks like he's quite likely to win, I hope this is the case, is that, you know, this was actually a really low, and this is a hypothesis, that this was actually a really low moment for Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband never dreamed that he would be, you know, sitting in front of a TV camera saying, these strikes are wrong, over and over and over again. And the reason he felt he had to do that was because he thought that, you know, left-wing politics hasn't got a future. It's got, it's, you know, and also all the people around him were telling him, you've got to go right-wing, you've got to go right-wing, because you've been called Red Ed in the tabloids. This is what I hope, although I don't think it's particularly likely, but this is, you know, what I'm praying and what I'm hoping. It's a
coherent argument.
If Keir Starmer is elected, he is the Ed Miliband always wanted to be, because he's seen that actually, if you are openly and actively left-wing, then people actually, you know, take you more seriously than if you just constantly triangulate and ultimately end up speaking absolutely nothing to nobody.
Jo, you did a PhD on New Labour and higher education.
Unionism, but yeah.
Well, go on.
So my PhD was about the extent to which trade unions collaborated, if you like, with sort of neoliberal policy in the New Labour area,
And
particularly on pensions.
What case studies? What kind of sectors?
All manner of different sectors where you saw the
apologies.
downgrading of pension schemes.
Right. You've got both an intellectual kind of interest in this, know a hell of a lot about it, and also obviously practical because you're now working at the sort of the coalface of this as a worker, as a general secretary. Do you look at what Keir Starmer's saying? Do you look at the Ed Miliband clip, and do you think it's possible that Keir Starmer, as leader of the Labour Party, you've obviously said we need to come together, you need unity, etc. Do you think it's plausible that Labour, despite the sort of huge surge of membership, despite the turn left on policy, that it could go back to those days of, advocating neoliberalism in a bunch of areas, including higher education?
I mean, you can't rule anything out. And as someone who studies history, I hate being a hostage to fortune and predicting the future. However, I actually, despite the pessimism I said earlier, I'm quite hopeful, because I think one of the things that was problematic in the period that I did my PhD for, when I was looking in this contemporary period, which was like late 90s to sort of 2010, 2011 type time, is the sort of neoliberal thought world of New Labour had become so sort of hegemonic and so accepted that you had to do these things, and that if you stepped outside of doing these things, things would fall apart. I don't think that sort of hegemony exists anymore. Right. I think that whatever people think of sort of Corbyn and Corbynism, and whatever people think about the aftermath of this election, what we saw during that period was actually a reckoning of the period that I studied under New Labour. And I think, whatever people think about who they want to elect, the fact that Keir Starmer has visited these pickets, we have found ourselves in higher education on the kind of the forefront of a battleground of fighting against casualisation, of fighting against the idea that you labour for free, fighting against the deprofessionalisation of people in HE, fighting for students and for education, really. I think it's really powerful for him to attend those pickets and to speak at them. And I think my hope would be a bit different to what you're saying, and that actually it indicates not necessarily a new hegemony, if you like, but the idea that you can't just do that sort of interview and kind of almost dead-eyed hostage video of just repeating the same thing. And I think that, perhaps with the election of general secretaries like me, and of actually trade union movements transforming as well. Because, you might turn around and say, like, the sort of devil's advocate position you put forward earlier, HE workers are privileged, like, why are they fighting? But if you look at what we're fighting against, you look at what the CWU is fighting against, you look at what McStrikers are fighting against, you look at people who are being outsourced, it's about the degradation of employment conditions. I'm going to use this phrase again. It's about the idea that we have to be shock absorbers for a broken model of capitalism. You don't have to be some sort of socialist to think that and to recognise it. And I think that the days of a Labour leader being able to, do what Ed Miliband did in that interview, I genuinely think they're gone. And I think that there is enough movement now from members of Labour. I think there's enough popular acceptance that this way of governing the economy is sort of broken, that I don't think a Labour leader could slip back into that way of behaving. And you might think that I'm not keeping in touch with what's just happened in the general election and what's happening in the country by saying this, that I'm sort of existing on some other level. But I think that perhaps what we're seeing is, I feel like, I don't know if you feel this, but I sort of feel even despite how the election went, we're still on the cusp of things. I feel like things are still quite unsettled, and that things are still quite precarious, really, is my feeling.
Yes, well, I'm not too eager. I mean, I suspect whoever wins the Labour leadership, I think they'd all have a really difficult challenge, because like you say, I think the perspective here should probably be the next 10 years, not necessarily the next election. But at the same time, I wouldn't be overwhelmingly surprised if Keir Starmer won a small majority at the next election. I think it's unlikely, but where people say, he's got no chance. It's just like politics is so volatile right now. And what we do know for certain, like you say, is there has been clearly a reckoning with the kind of the establishment consensus of the centre/centre left. That's absolutely the legacy of Corbynism, if nothing else. And I agree, the dial's not being turned back. Somebody in the comments has said, do we need a PhD in politics? You said the word hegemony. No, all you need to do is open up a new tab on your computer and Google hegemony. beauty of the digital age.
Explain it though. Go on.
Well, no, that's the beauty of the digital age, isn't it? You know, the cost of entry into accessing information. Go on.
Dominant logic, does that help? You know, the idea that this one way of doing things is the way that things have to be done, to the point where when we say something's hegemonic, it basically means it becomes quite difficult to think of existing or operating outside of that sort of dominant way of thinking about things, essentially.
It's like the limits of what you can think and say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what
Common
happened
sense.
under New Labour is even the ability to think about what we might do became quite, you know, the boundaries came in and in and in. There's an amazing book by Norman Fairclough, which was New Labour, New Language. And he talks about this and how the language constructed what was possible. And then what we thought was possible actually became very much determined by that language. And I think that has broken down a bit now, to the point where you do have battlegrounds that still exist.
It's all right. I was maybe a bit cheeky there, but it's true. I love learning, you know, new. It's never been easier. We've got 1,000 people watching. All I want you to do right now is just smash the like button. We've got 249 likes, 1,000 people watching. That doesn't make sense to me. I'd appreciate it if you can do that. Also, if you like what you're watching, if you think that voices like Jo's are critical in building a left both in Britain and abroad, and if you think Novara can be part of giving them more of a platform, not that Jo needs it, she's been doing the Victoria Derbyshire show today, then please go to support.novaramedia.com or Novara Media /support. Make a one-off payment, or we sometimes recommend a subscription, a monthly payment, which we recommend being an hour's waged work. So as long as you're earning more than the living wage. So if you're earning £15 an hour, £15 a month would be very warmly received. We've got a documentary out later this week, or maybe early next week, about Assange's present extradition.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
I'm not spilling the beans there because we did
we speak to top politicians, academics, journalists. The documentary is going to include Yanis Varoufakis, Peter Oborne, Assange's lawyer. We showed that clip on Monday's show. And I mean, this is really, I really recommend, well, obviously watch the documentary when it comes out, but also read up on this particular case, because it is, you know, obviously it's been a very complex 10 years when it comes to the character that is Julian Assange. But this case is incredibly clear cut. It is the Trump administration who are wanting to extradite someone who published classified materials as a spy. The New York Times are saying this is exactly the same as what we do as journalists, and he is getting charged for espionage. The first time anyone's been charged for this, for journalistic activities. The act's been around since 1917. Obama had said that he would not charge Julian Assange for this because of the implications it would have for press freedom, and also because he thought it would be unconstitutional. Obviously, Donald Trump had no such qualms, even though, if we're to believe Assange's lawyer, and we have no reason not to, Donald Trump, one of his associates, did tell Julian Assange that if he were to give evidence, that the DNC leak, so those leaks that damaged Hillary Clinton in 2016, didn't come from Russia, then he would get a pardon. So I mean, the whole thing is an absolute mess, and the idea that Britain would extradite someone to these absolute amateurs, they come visit this guy and say, we'll let you off if you give evidence in our favour. This is an outrage. He should not be extradited, and this will all become apparent in that mini documentary.
We don't need the documentary anymore. Michael's just spelled it out. I mean, what's it?
You can hear it from people who are much more authoritative than I am.
Because you've got Luke Harding and some other person at The Guardian basically published the password so people could actually access a lot more data than Assange was willing to sort of make public.
Yeah, by accident.
So The Guardian published actually really, really critical data by accident. And so if Assange is being charged as a spy, like you say, it's a very increasingly permeable barrier, and it's a really frightening thing for press freedom. Anyway, we've got the last part of tonight's show. We're going to talk about free speech and the Free Speech Union, which has been started by professional provocateur. And well, this is Michael's prose. I would never write this. Boob ogler, Toby Young. Of course, Michael is referring to Toby Young sexually assaulting a woman in America whilst pretending to be a woman. Is that what you're referring to?
I was actually referring to many of his tweets.
Right.
So Assange has a history of
not Assange.
Sorry.
Well,
Toby,
that's the case
Assange
as
has his
well.
own history, but not on Twitter. So Toby Young has and I suppose with Assange we should say it's alleged. With Toby Young, it is confirmed that on Twitter he has tweeted a lot about women on television's boobs.
He's also written articles about sexually assaulting people.
What was the background for that one? What was that? When
he wrote an article about meeting a woman in a gay bar in America,
and he was
dressed as a woman, and he copped off with her. And then he wrote a story about basically dealing drugs to camera crews. And when I met him on doing Politics Live, we finished the show and he said, I never dealt drugs, don't you? And I was like, well, you did. It's just because you're a white guy that went to Oxford, so you don't call it that. So yes, the Free Speech Union. This is their founding statement. Start. Free speech is the bedrock on which all our other freedoms rest, yet it is currently in greater peril than at any time since the Second World War. The Free Speech Union is a non-partisan mass membership organisation that stands up for the speech rights of its members. If you think there's a risk to be penalised for exercising your legal right to free speech that doesn't exist in Britain, whether it's the workplace or the public square, you need the protection of the Free Speech Union. How might we protect you? And then it lists a bunch of things. Basically, if you find yourself being targeted by a digital outrage mob on social media for having exercised your legal right to free speech, we will mobilise an army of supporters. I mean, okay, that's kind of strange. Talks about petitions, about if you're no platformed, how we can collectively respond, if you're punished by your employer, give you legal assistance, etc. Basically, it's providing it's establishing a network for collective action for those who care passionately about free speech. We're now going to look at an interview between Steve Edgington from The Sun, also works with Guido Fawkes sometimes. Didn't even know he was at The Sun. I thought he was at Guido still.
He moved on from Guido very quickly.
Yeah, he was also involved in some Leave campaigning. So he's hardly a progressive voice. Steve Edgington and Toby Young. And let's see how quickly he embarrasses himself and reveals just how stupid this entire endeavour really is.
Is Tommy Robinson in your Free Speech Union? Would you allow him to come in?
Well, Tommy Robinson hasn't applied to be in my union yet. And I think that would be, again, a decision for the board and the advisory council rather than a decision for me. But I would say that he's welcome to become a member of the union. We have a statement of values and we encourage our members not to criticise people in the course of making an argument for their membership of various groups. So not to criticise them because they're a member of a particular ethnic group or a particular religious group, or because they happen to be a woman, or even because they happen to be a man. Provided he'd be willing to sign up to that statement of values, then yeah, I think we'd let him in.
So don't be racist, don't be sexist, basically.
Yeah, but
do you think he has been? Do you think he said those comments in the past?
I think some of the comments he's made about Muslims cross the line.
Which ones?
You know, he's I couldn't pull anything out of my hat, but the implication is that I think in the past he has strongly implied that there is a direct causal link between being a Muslim and being a member of a grooming gang. That's the context in which you have to understand those terrible crimes. And I don't think that's right. And I think that borders on Islamophobia.
What did you make of that, Jo? As an academic who's, your job is rigour and, precision. What did you think of Toby Young's argument? Not particularly bulletproof, was it?
Where to start? I mean, I think that there's a big difference between you saying that your freedom of speech is being curtailed and people just not wanting to hear it. I think that there's been so much mixing up of terms amongst these debates. I think, if we link it back to academic freedom, for example, the academic freedom, as we understand it in the UK, comes from the 1997 UNESCO. They published clear recommendations on academic freedom. And it's not just the ability to say whatever you want and outrage people. What actually academic freedom within that document outlines is 2 recommendations for people. And that is about concerning the self-governance of the universities that they work at and the right to criticise your own employer. Now, if you think about other countries where that doesn't exist, and whether that's a very right-wing government where you can get sacked for criticising your employer, or that you aren't able to regulate your institution, the idea that he manipulates that in the way that's, being put forward by this union, I think is quite disreputable, actually. And I think that, if you link this back to the disputes that UCU members are involved in, what we've seen before during previous strikes, so obviously often people take to Twitter to say what they think about their employer. That sometimes means criticising your employer. We have seen some instances where universities discipline academics for making those views when they've brought negative comments about their institution, that they're bringing them into disrepute.
Can you give me any examples? Or, I mean, obviously you can't verbatim, but kind of ballpark, what kinds of things are being said?
So there was some examples during the last USS strike in 2018 where UCU members who were on strike set up parody accounts that, were not defamatory or anything, but just poked fun at university managers with paper-thin skin, and they didn't like it. And there are instances where they were threatened with disciplinary procedures if they didn't delete things and if they didn't, sort of toe the line. That is a real threat, and that's in the UK. If you go to sort of other countries where those restrictions, and the protection of academic freedoms don't exist, you can see people losing their jobs. But, in the UK, if you're not an academic, you're not covered by academic freedom. So our members of UCU and professional services, can't fight back in the same way. But in addition to that, what we also see, and this is part of the broader criticism that we have of higher education, is punitive funding regimes where you have to align yourself with a particular type of research, and that then has to be favoured by the REF, which is an audit of research. The abolition of tenure and casualisation, that impacts on your academic freedom if you have to toe the line in order to benefit from continuation of employment. All of these things actually impact on your ability to exercise academic freedom. And if we think about the prevent duty, that recently came into the news because what it revealed was that universities were acting in a really overzealous way and were reporting student essays to be investigated by the police that were, flagged up as counter-terrorism. These are genuine attacks on people's academic freedom. If you've got objectionable, bigoted views and people just don't want you to come to their event anymore, I just don't even see that in the same league as what we're talking about, particularly if you compare it to countries where, academic freedoms lead to people being sacked by oppressive regimes. So, I'm not really very impressed by that, I guess.
Michael?
Yeah, I suppose just to comment on the video. So that particular video has sort of started a bit of a kind of interesting debate in a way on Twitter as to whether or not Toby Young in that explanation really undermined the point of his union. And the debate is clearly in that video, he is accepting there should be some sort of political limits to freedom of speech, or at least or at least the right to be defended on Twitter, as that seems to be what this union is designed to do. And that's seen as incoherent if what Toby Young's argument for is for free speech absolutism, basically. So anyone should be able to say anything, and we should completely remove politics and power and consequences from the discussion of speech. Now,
including incitement? I mean, where does he draw the line here?
So other people have responded to say that actually this free speech union isn't about free speech absolutism. And so what it is about is a concern that legitimate speech is being infringed upon. Not in terms of the police knocking on your door, but in terms of people being driven out of their jobs, et cetera, which I mean could be a legitimate concern. But I think that the significant thing here is to say that what Toby Young definitely does do there is to say that it's a political decision where we limit what's acceptable to say. I think we all believe that you should be allowed to say pretty much anything if it's not inciting violence before you get arrested or put in jail or something. But in terms of what should it be acceptable to say and believe for you to be in a particular job. So, for example, with Sabisky, who was the person who was employed by Dominic Cummings, I don't think it should be illegal to talk about black people being genetically less intelligent than white people, even though I think it's complete pseudoscience and nonsense. But I do think that should make it inappropriate for you to have a job in the civil service or in the highest echelons of government. What this does show about Toby Young's project, though, is it is political where you draw this line. And what's clear about this free speech union is that they're not interested in free speech in general, because everyone in it is a right-winger. Everyone in it, the only time they've got in trouble is because they've said something about trans women, or they've said something about gender equality, or they've said something that other people consider racist. There's no one in this free speech union on the advisory board, and it's a huge list of, you know, the standard right-wingers you see on TV and in you know, the comment pages of the Times. There's no one who's interested in, I mean, for example, the fact that there's Julian Assange is about to be extradited. Whatever you think of him personally, he's someone who has published materials and is going to be extradited to America for espionage and potentially put in prison. Well, we wouldn't be in prison for 175 years, but that would be the sentence he gets. These aren't people who are interested in the Prevent program, which, as you were describing, means that some people get reported to the police for what they've written in their essays. And these aren't people who have ever cared about the Palestinian people's right to talk about racism in the creation of the State of Israel, which displaced them and their descendants because of their ethnic background. You know, and who get told that, you know, that you can't keep your job or you can't keep your role in a political party because you're called anti-Semitic for that. So what Toby Young has to admit is that this is a political project, and it's a political project specifically to allow people to say things which, you know, many black people consider racist, to say things which many trans women consider transphobic, and to say things which many women consider to be sexist. Nothing else. They're not concerned about things that those in power are telling us we cannot say because it will threaten their interests. About that, they don't give a shit.
Yeah. And I think what it reveals is that actually what they want is impunity to say whatever they want. And I think the fact that actually what you see is that it's about protecting them as a group saying something is they do have to manufacture this idea that they are being silenced. And it's like, well, you're not being silenced if you're holding a microphone. You know, you're not being silenced if you're frequently given access to pages in broadsheet newspapers. And I think, you know, you've hit the nail on the head that what they actually want is just to be able to say what they want and never face any consequences. And actually, people just don't like your views and criticize them and therefore withdraw participation from funding the journalism that you're part of. Well, yeah, that's it.
We're going to go to questions very shortly. Sorry for my cough. It's because I think I'm drinking too much tea these days. I shouldn't have coughed right into the microphone either. Before we do go to questions, I just want to sort of finish this section off with, here's an article from NPR about how at least 250 professors have been targeted by right-wing campaigns because of their research, with some of them losing jobs. This is part of a campaign which has been overseen by Turning Point in the United States. It's been around since 2012. They have something called the Professor Watch List. And the Professor Watch List has an index of featured professors. So this is kind of like, you know, freelance Stasi. So these are the people shutting down free speech on campuses, you know, in a very organized, coordinated, well-resourced way. Like I say, Professor Watch List. Now, you might be watching this, you might be based in Britain or just not based in the United States, think, wow, that's crazy, that's never coming here. We have in Britain Education Watch, which has, of course, been started by Turning Point UK. That's right, they're the very same people who've spent £15,000 on Facebook ads attacking Labour and particularly Rebecca Long-Bailey in the last month. It's easy to laugh at these people, and you should, because they're ridiculous, but they also have lots of money behind them, and there's clearly an agenda to clamp down on freedom of speech for people on the left, whilst giving permission to those on the right to say things which, frankly, should be beyond the pale. And we write them off at our peril. Let's go to some questions. And if you've got any questions, either go on the hashtag TiskiSour or in the comments with the rocket emoji. This is from RLB for Leader. Is that right, Fox? Not so much a question, but on the poll, it is worth noting that RLB wins among 2015 to 19 members. Didn't know that. That's interesting. Whereas it's enterists, well, let's not use that word, who are overwhelming, 63% voting for Starmer. That's interesting. Have you got any thoughts on that, Michael?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. So it's people who joined before 2015 favour Starmer, people who joined between 2015 and 2019 favour Rebecca Long-Bailey, and people who joined in 2020 or after the general election defeat, they favour Starmer by an overwhelming majority. I mean, I think, as you indicated, I'd push back against this idea that they are enterists. I think it's quite healthy in a political party that people are able to join during a leadership election, because I think that if you can build momentum for your campaign in the membership and the wider public, you deserve to win. So I think it's clear on this show that we have concerns or doubts about what Keir Starmer how effective he'll be as a Labour leader and how true he'll be to the kind of politics that we back. But he will have won fair and square whenever his supporters joined the party, because if he can create a membership surge, and it seems like 100,000 people joined the Labour Party after the general election, well done. The more people in the Labour Party, the better.
I would add to that, you win elections by getting votes from people who aren't in your base. And if what he is able to do is identify people who are natural supporters of him or that he can speak to and represent, and that they have joined the party to vote for him, that's impressive.
Agreed. Although it's an interesting observation. Although, to be fair, a lot of people may be rejoining, memberships lapse, or you leave a party and they may not necessarily be voting for Starmer. So that cohort of 2015 to 2019 might not be as bulletproof as we think. This is from Eric B. Which academic fields are most affected by these issues? I presume that's referring to freedom of speech. Are there any particular cases in amongst your members where that's pretty obvious?
Philosophy's the battleground at the minute for these discussions, I would say.
In what respect is that?
I think in terms of the idea that you are able to ask questions, but that also that you are able to articulate your point of view on something that could, in terms of what you were saying with regarding freedom of speech and academic freedom, and the extent to which your ability to do that is more important than observing other protocols, whether that would be the law, as you were sort of suggesting, or other types of groups or equality legislation, that kind of issue.
So I suppose you say, in terms of the challenge in various, I suppose, disciplines, are you saying that in philosophy that's precisely where the right are trying to push the boundaries of what's acceptable to say, or where there's some pushback against what left-wingers might want to say?
I mean, I don't know if I would categorize it as left and right. I think what I would just say is that is a discipline, I think, where you see more of those discussions happening than others. I think the nature of it as a discipline probably tends to prompt that too.
Mm-hmm. All right. This question from Chris Jarvis. It's for you, Jo. What policies on higher and further education do you want to see the Labour leadership candidates committing to? And by the way, Chris gave us a £5 super chat. Thank you very much, Chris.
Oh. I think FE is an area that any government, but particularly Labour Party, and they were really good previously with Angela Rayner. When I talk about the anti-working class agenda of education, it very much starts with FE. When I was 17, 16, I was part of, I didn't have it, I didn't get it myself, but my friends, we were part of the pilot group for the EMA, for the Educational Maintenance Allowance. I had a lot of friends who the only reason they did A-levels is because they were able to give that cash to their mum and dad. I think that's a massive barrier to a lot of working class kids when they leave school, being able to stay on and actually think about something they might want to do when they're 18 because they just don't get to do A-levels. And I think also adult education and that kind of further education package, anybody who doesn't get to do that education when they're younger and then follow that direct route into university, if that's what you want to do, there's no chance for people to have that second chance at education anymore. That kind of pathway has been taken away. Adult education has been completely cut. So FE and adult ed are absolutely central. HE I could wax on about as well, but I think without really putting those two things in place, it's really difficult to see how we're going to have that type of, working class that you were talking about earlier.
Not the answer people might expect. They would expect the sort of focus on tuition fees. And
yeah, well, I mean, that would be great too, but I think FE and adult ed are really important.
This from Kaylee Browncoat. I presume it's not your name necessarily, Kaylee, but that's fine. How does the left create a narrative around free speech to undermine the right in this area, an area that the left is traditionally quite strong on? Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I've often said on this show as well that I don't think that even though I think that Toby Young's project is very transparently an attempt for people with a large degree of power to present themselves as victims when that's not really the role they play in society, or how society treats them. They have enormous platforms, and one of the reasons why they're receiving pushback is because there are many people who see what they are saying as both poorly evidenced and two as having negative consequences on other people's lives. But I do also think that actually the left has at times forgotten the value of free speech, and that people are a bit too quick to close down many discussions. I think this is both because there are intrinsic values to free speech. We shouldn't let the right take that principle as one of their own. But two, I think in pragmatic terms, it often makes the left poorer at making arguments. So because the left is so unwilling to, or some sections of the left sometimes is very unwilling to engage in a debate with someone who disagrees with them, because they say that, I shouldn't have to debate. The phrase is often, I shouldn't have to debate my existence, or, this isn't. The other one that often comes up is to say, this isn't a rational debate. What's the point in a debate? Because this is about a power struggle, not reason. And I think that's often utilised way too prematurely. And so I do think the left do need to rediscover sort of the value of debate and the value of reasonable argument a bit more than they have. I'm giving a terrible triangulating answer here, because I'm saying neither Toby Young nor the tendency among some in the left to shut down debate a little bit too early.
Jo?
I think I'd think that the ability to articulate your position on things and have a debate, if that's what you want to do, is important. But I think. And maybe this is where some of the questions are sort of directing. There's a difference between people who are on a kind of a level playing field, if you like, kicking ideas around and debating. But I think if what you are doing, to go back to what you were saying, is actually debating the validity of people, then I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to say, I don't want to have this debate with you because I fundamentally think that what you are doing in invalidating people or experiences is dangerous. And I don't think that that's shutting down debate to say that you're not going to participate in a conversation that invalidates people. And I think that if the parties that are having that debate are talking about other groups in particular, I think that there's real power dynamics there that are quite challenging. And I think particularly, when I think about my perspective now, when I go home to Wakefield and, I speak a bit fancy than I did when I was younger, and I've got this PhD, the words that you say carry a legitimacy and a power that other people's don't. So I think with any kind of free speech and the ability to say, you should listen to me because these are my views and I'm educated, they come with a real responsibility to consider the consequences of the things that you're saying. And that's not to say you can't say them and you can't go around and have debates, but that you also have to face the consequences if the consequences of your language, result in a spike in hate crime towards a group of people that your language invalidates.
I mean, I'm something of a free speech fundamentalist, accept incitement and accept the stuff you're talking about. Of course, you have to play it by ear. And I think also in a private setting, in an institution, if somebody employs somebody else and they don't like what they've said and it doesn't adhere to the values of the organisation, they have every right to, within the parameters of their processes, to say that's not acceptable. If you repeatedly do it, you have to go out, etc. I don't think you should be able to say whatever you like. However, I think it really crystallised for me around the IHRA debate with Labour around freedom of speech, and there was a huge constricting of the debate in a really anti-academic way. And I found it quite worrying. And like you say, Michael, I think let me give you a good example of this. If somebody says the Nakba was racist, right, which it was, and then somebody says the Nakba was a foundational act of the State of Israel after 1948, we can argue that. I think it possibly was. Was it an inevitable outgrowth of the state that occupying sort of people who were settling there after the 1910s, 20s, was that inevitable? We don't know. We can have that discussion, etc. And when I saw people trying to shut that down and how that related to the relationship between Europeans and people in West Asia, I was like, fuck, this is a really, really big thing. Whereas before I was kind of like, with you, I was kind of like, free speech, generally speaking, it's like a thing that the right talks about. But then I was like, I could see how the subaltern is actually silenced in quite a scary way, and in the name of progressive values. You've seen Palestinians called racist for saying that how they're treated was racist. And so, I don't know, what do you think?
I think I can't really comment on the example that you're giving, but I think what I would say is that people get silenced in lots of other ways, and it's not just about free speech in that way. And, there's lots of narratives that never actually get any amplification. And I just think that, to me, maybe I exist in a sort of a different space to you, but I don't see this as the most pressing issue that we as a left movement have to battle. And I think
unless it's the right coming after us, right, as Professor Watchlist is doing, etc. It might happen, but not yet.
Yeah, but I think this is a reason, as a trade union, we say, well, actually, we fight for academic freedom because this is a genuine attack on academic freedom. And I don't think you have to tie yourself up in knots in this, in this debate about freedom of speech and where you stand on it by saying, this is a clear employment issue. You know, UNESCO in the UK enshrines that this, as an academic, is what you can do. And, you know, that doesn't matter if you're a right-wing academic and you're teaching something about eugenics, or, you know, you're a left-wing academic and you're teaching something that, you know, is considered equally ideologically dubious. The point is within the remit of your class, you have the freedom to teach those things and to research those things. Where it becomes different is if you then think you are able to use bigoted language towards people, particularly if that is, you know, positioned outside of equality legislation. Your personal views on things, if you have to, you know, operate within a workplace legislative framework, are not protected in that sense. And that's very different to students going after Professor Left Wing. And I think it's important to hold that they're two distinct things, personally.
Mark, do you want to say anything? Well, it's obviously a big issue. It's one of the final parts of the show.
It's a big issue, and it's getting a bit abstract at the moment, isn't it? I mean, I suppose my position here is one, I do think that, you know, shutting down debates early can mean that you end up with positions that aren't, you know, as critically thought out as they could be. And two, on a fundamental level, it's strategically inept to shut down an argument before you've won it. And I think that there are many areas of life where the left has done that. So if you look at the example of, say, race science, that argument has been won. So the moment we're having a debate about whether some people are genetically this, that, or the other, I mean, I think no one is genetically less intelligent than other people, or like no group is less intelligent than another group. But for us even to be having that debate, I think is giving ground to the right. Because the fact that that's up for debate, I think that's right, that should be. That's a conversation, an argument that's been had, and it's done. When it comes to, I mean, trans issues would be the key one here. When it comes to something like the Gender Recognition Act and whether or not there should be exemptions in certain women's spaces, that's not an argument that's been won. So to then shut down conversation about it seems inept, and it means that you'll ultimately lose the argument.
I have to just say, I don't think you can just say it's been won so frequently. You know, you see often black women on chat shows having to educate white hosts about how racism works. I think to say it's been done completely ignores the fact that minority groups are constantly having to educate people about how debating racism is damaging. And I think that, you know, I disagree with you.
No, what I mean by it's one is Sabisky was sacked because it's currently seen as, and I think rightly seen as, socially inappropriate to debate and to state that some people, because of their racial group, are less intelligent than others.
Sabisky was saying mad
stuff. It's good that
Sabisky's like the 0.001%.
But Boris Johnson is Prime
in the
Minister and he has said horrifically racist things.
Yeah, but so what I'm saying is I think it makes sense for the left to shut down that debate, because for it to be opened would create an opportunity for the right to gain ground. When it comes to something about trans women's rights to be in women's spaces, I think I think trans women should have the right to be in cis women's spaces, sorry. But I think to say that that's something that you're not allowed to have a conversation about, which is often the case on Twitter, means that you're going to get a massive backlash socially because you're trying to shut down an argument before you've won it in society at large, which is why Dominic Cummings is licking his lips, because he's realised that actually on this issue, the left haven't yet won the argument, but they're kind of out of sync with the rest of society. So I think that's an argument you have to have and you have to win it.
Fox wants to wrap up. Jo, go on. You can respond
I
to
just
that.
think it goes back to what I was saying about who is silenced and who is having these debates, because I often think, particularly with the example you've just used of, you know, trans women in cis spaces, I frequently see trans rights being debated by cis people. And I think, you know, it goes back to, we might say, you know, talking about racism, that it's right to shut down those debates because we've agreed on it. But the fact that a prime minister can be elected in this country means that many people haven't moved on and it is still a debate for them. And I think that what I'm saying is that to say, well, I'm not going to take part in that debate, or we're not going to invite that person to this space. And maybe I'm not kind of like articulating it very well, but I think that it is perfectly fine to say, no, I'm not having that debate with you, because what you are doing is invalidating this group of people, particularly if this group of people are never part of that debate. You know, if they're never on the platform, so then they never have the microphone in their hands.
I mean, it's a strategic question. I think you can refuse to take part in whatever debate you want, but if you won't have that debate and the rest of the public thinks something else, then you're probably going to lose the next election, and probably those rights will not be increased.
I agree with you in that the debate around, for instance, black civil rights had to be won through social movements in a very contentious, you know,
and there were many arguments.
agonistic political way, and maybe you can't shy away from those. However, this will be another show, or maybe many shows. Michael loves this topic. It's an interesting topic. But in terms of its salience to the left, not obviously top of the list. Thank you, Dave Smith, for a £5 super chat. Thank you, Benjamin Hume, for a £4.99 super chat. You asked a great question about National Education Service. We haven't got time, I'm afraid. I think you hinted at that with adult education and FE. And then somebody saying, when are you going to do a show in the north, desperate for Novara to open up an office here? If we have another bureau, it will be in the north, and that won't be Manchester. It will be, somewhere proper.
Wakefield.
Yeah, somewhere proper. As much as I love Manchester. Jo, thank you very much. Good luck with industrial action as it continues.
Thank you.
When are you back on strike again?
Next week, Monday.
Next Monday. Until Wednesday?
Thursday. Yeah.
Well, good
so
luck.
to visit one of the 74 pickets, if you go on the UCU website, there's a list.
Good.
And donate to our fighting fund as well. You can find a link to that there.
Calls to action. Yes, very good. And if they want to follow you on Twitter, you are Dr. Jo Grady?
Dr. Jo Grady.
Excellent. Michael, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
We will see you again, I think, on Friday.
Yes.
We were meant to be talking to Julia Ebner about her new book on far-right extremism. She's had to pull back because of far-right extremists tomorrow. So we can't do that. We'll be back on Friday. Good night.